the studio is like a gigantic mutated version of my bedroom when I was about 9 years old.
Hi, I'm Marcus Fairs, and I'm founder and editor-in-chief of Dezeen, the online architecture and design magazine. And this is our face-to-face podcast series in which I sit down with some of the world's leading architects and designers and find out what they do, how they got there, and how they started out. In this episode, I speak to Thomas Heatherwick, a designer whose projects range from the New London Bus to the cauldron at the London 2012 Olympic Games to the vessel, the kind of staircase-covered sculptural object at Hudson Yards in New York. Although not an architect, Thomas is now building on a vast scale with massive projects underway, including the new Google campus at Mountain View in California. Thomas consciously decided not to study architecture because he didn't like the academic and theoretical aspects of the profession. However, when he was on his design course, instead of producing furniture and lights and industrial products like all the other students, he decided to create a building as his final project. In this interview, Thomas looks back and explains how that small wood and plastic pavilion came to define his entire career. I've known Thomas for many, many years, and in fact, a lot of people think we look so similar that they get confused when we're together. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the interview with the fantastically talented and extremely good-looking Thomas Heatherwick. This episode is sponsored by Twinmotion, the real-time architectural visualization solution for creating stunning visuals and immersive experiences in seconds. Learn more at twinmotion.com. Hi Thomas, nice to see you. We're here at Heatherwick Studio near King's Cross in London. Tell us a little bit about the setup you have here.
In a sense, the studio is like a gigantic mutated version of my bedroom when I was about 9 years old. And it's workshop space, which also has inevitably quite a lot of computers. A lot of the objects that are remnants of design processes that we've been working on and failed experiments and objects. I mean, I just find that we have got quite bad memories, and so you need to have all your junk around you so that you can refer back and get prompts that your brain in a conversation might otherwise get stuck. We're based in King's Cross, so we're just here a couple of 100 metres away from the Eurostar train station, St Pancras heading off to Paris. And when we first moved here 17 years ago, there weren't hedge funds and people like that nearby. So it's a funny one to justify now having a big workshop and welding equipment and printers and making team. We've got 15 makers in the team, but we are trying to understand as broadly the full context of making places, which is the physical, the ethical, the political dimension, the program, and this is our 25th year. So we're sort of finally getting into a stride in a way. It takes a long time.
How many people do you have working here? When you come in, there's a kind of tunnel full of bikes. So I guess those are your team. They're mostly cycling in, are they? And there's a kitchen just out here. Is this your office we're sitting in here? Talk about the people you have here and the zones in the office.
We're in 5 spaces in King's Cross. So actually, this is the main space, and the team is now 230 people. And there's a small team in Shanghai. There's a small team in Mountain View in California working on the Google projects there. We've also had a little team in Hong Kong as well, and in New York. We're sort of set up to do whatever it takes to see a project all the way through, but food is pretty central, and actually some of the most creative people here, frustratingly, are not working on our projects, but make the context for the projects. We've got an amazing head chef lady, and she responds to the projects and takes 3D molds and casts of all the different projects we're working on and turns them edible in different ways. It's good provocation for the design teams as well when the gastronomic dimension is looking and tasting more creative than the projects we're working on.
I came to the launch party here of Cold Drops Yard, which is just a few minutes walk away, and they were serving some food that was themed about Cold Drops Yard. Was it the lift buttons or something was turned into a cake or something like that?
Well, it's just, in each project, you've always got the big scale and its relationship to the city and trying to make as much public interaction and public space as possible. But without love in the details, projects don't really mean anything. And I think I got interested in that when I was little, seeing places where there was a big idea, but it left you cold. For example, with Cold Drops, there was a limited budget and you can't make everything. special on something or connect with people. But one bit you touch is dumbly sounding the lift buttons. And so we made these buttons that will, as you touch them, the more you touch them, the more they'll age and shine. And it was very influenced in our conversations in the studio by, in Moscow, in the subway station, there's one of them with these big bronze sculptures everywhere. And in the middle of all this brownness, there's one dog, and the dog's snout is gleaming gold. And about 1 in 8 people who walks past touches the nose. And just thought, well, what's the bit that you touch in the Coal Drops project? And maybe for a very small amount of money, you can make our 6 cores each have an idea that's touchable. And so it was just funny for me when you watch how people respond to something, where there was the main move which we proposed of making an additional 20,000 square foot of more space that was the glue fusing together 2 existing buildings that were technically too far apart and made no heart. So that made a heart. That costs a certain amount, but then the lift buttons for 6 cores costs nothing, and yet people were remembering them as much as the big move that you make in a project. And I found that very life-affirming about this humanity within projects. And we were also influenced in New York. There's a project, and there's these 2 sculptures by a sculptor called Botero, 2 naked figures. And you can imagine the shiny bits on the man and the shiny bit on the woman. So our lift buttons are shinyable and a bit rude.
In what way are they a bit rude?
There's indents and protuberances that human nature wants to touch. So I think in each thing you're interested in what association do things make in people's minds, and touching is a key. What makes you touch something and connect your physicality and not just your cerebral intellectual connection to places. And that's something that we talk about a lot. Excitingly, now more and more city planners and commissioners are understanding that this human dimension is essential, because the digital revolution has turned upside down the old rules of why people went to places. And you don't need to go shopping, you don't need to even go to university. You can stay in bed and get a PhD. And why would you go to university? It's the place to meet people. And how do you make somewhere that's about that human engagement? And that comes down to very raw physicality that we all share, and urges and impulses and emotion as a function. I'm excited by how you make a human-centric modern movement in architecture and design.
When you walk into your studio, first thing you see is this giant model of the Google campus that you're building in Mountain View. And you talked about the digital revolution is almost setting a challenge to architects and designers, because so much of what we do is digital. There's no tactility to it. And you talked about the lift buttons at Coal Drops Yard, which is a shopping centre just near here, in the former coal yard near King's Cross. But how do you take that philosophy to Google itself, which in a way is the kind of driver of much of this switch to the virtual?
So we formed a partnership with BIG in the US and agreed to design 50-50 together the projects, and started by thinking about the relationship of the Silicon Valley and the Bay, and the need for a better connection to the nature. The nature had been sort of pushed out by these tarmac tutus around the existing buildings, really, covered in cars. So this car parking was suppressing a nature dimension from the Bay. Whether we could, one, start to manage and reduce the traffic side so that you're making buildings that sit within a more human scale, more accessible for a pedestrian scale interaction. And I mean, originally I was very wary about being involved, actually, because I wasn't interested in big headquarters behind fences that are from a distance. And the studio's projects are motivated by their relationship to the public. And so people's private worlds isn't inspiring to us. And so the realization that this wasn't about a single building, but there was a collection of sites that would be making a piece of town. One of the largest of the buildings has got a public route through the middle of it. So you'll be able to walk or cycle through the middle of one of the main buildings. So that's a total reversal of the normal sort of selfishness of big organizations or fear culture that can be there. Those buildings, in terms of the human scale, there's been a need for space for 4,000 or 5,000 more people working each year. And that quantum is massive and really easy to squeeze out the human scale completely. And so there was an excitement at the efficiency and opportunity that scale gave. But at the same time, how do you find that human scale? And so there's one part of that is the nature. And so there's been a big horticultural push. Another part is making buildings that are very flexible so that they can shift and change over the decades. The design really most came from analysing the existing area. And right next to our site is the NASA airbase, the Moffett airfield. And on the airfield were these 3 gigantic former airship hangars from a century ago. Amazing spaces. And you just thought that's actually the key, is the flexibility of big spanning structures, which can then allow the 2-story buildings within that to be really hyper adjustable and changeable. So our main first phase of projects, which will start finishing quite soon, are hangars with high flexibility internally, with courtyards, this green loop, this public route through the middle of one of the main ones of them. Their entire skin is made from photovoltaic solar panel. So instead of the typical thing, you get a building and like postage stamps, stick a few solar panels on, the entire roof it's like a semi-rigid sheet of photovoltaic that, like a Bedouin tent, is pulled down over tent poles, pulled tight. So as a tension structure, it's very efficient, but it's raw. It's on the inside, it's not flashy finishes at all, but that's going to generate 30 to 40% of all its power needs. The interior is like an exterior world, and it can be shifted and changed as organizations change over time. And I think we've suffered from non-flexibility and non-repairability in buildings for the last few decades. So I think things can be much rougher and rawer, and that's part of what I'm excited about in the collaboration and in what we'll be finishing.
And you'd expect that at a Google headquarters, everything would be touch screen or facial recognition and super smart. But what would be the equivalent of the tactile lift button at the Google HQ?
There will be a lot of the latest technology, of course, but that's always shifting and changing. So there's some basic physicality, and how these giant tents come and meet the ground is going to be kind of raw, and there's no sort of nicey cladding covering over things. You're going to see those forces coming down to the ground, and there is quite a no-nonsense approach to all the bits that you'll touch, and probably the simplicity of handles and paving and framing of space is going to be simple. We are putting a lot onto the nature, actually, as a human scale. And there's no gimmicks. No, it's just the raw truth of that, which I think will give a lot of human scale at the same time as this large spanning structures will be doing this macro scale.
So people will know they're in the real world rather than the digital world.
Utterly. I mean, the lovely thing about the digital world is it's not a world, and it's tools, and they slot into the physical world, the unquestionable physicality that we all have. And I think that when the digital revolution was coming, I mean, the studio started 25 years ago, and in a sense, I started by myself. It was just, I didn't know who else to work for. And I think my assumption was that there might be 5 or 6 or 7 people, but that we would be working despite the way government was, the kind of Tory landscape of how government was, and despite the commercial forces that made places, and despite the regulatory conditions and planners. Then the digital revolution just accelerated at us, and that certainly then seemed like, well, of course we would be pushed aside because it'll only be about, the focus will be on the virtual. But actually the digital has meant the hyper-physical has become more important than ever, and it's a thrilling time for us. We are juggling both in our projects, and because you can make a smart piece of city, we can work with Sidewalk Labs in Toronto, or we can work in Tokyo or Prague on all of these things. But now people are potentially lonelier than ever because they can have some quasi-social interaction while lying in their bed, and they can buy everything they need for their clothing, for their food, and understand the world's knowledge without leaving a home. But we are social. Humans are so social, and the convening of public places as excuses that inspire you to get over yourself and get out of yourself is an interesting challenge. But a challenge we're finding is that governments have lost their confidence to commission themselves to make places. You know, the British government is not making, I mean, we're sitting here, we're a few hundred metres away from a 50-acre site has been developed by a development company, not by the city, in arguably the most busy transport interchange in London. And that's happening all over the world. It's an interesting one. It's depending on benevolence, well-intentioned, wise property development companies working with talented planners. And we've been finding that city planners, everyone loves to blame the city planner, but there are some absolutely brilliant city planners around who are making meaningful partnerships with whoever there is to drive good places. I feel very optimistic that there are ways to work with the people around to try to make character. And I think there was, in the past, you didn't need to think about the character of a place. It's amazed me growing up how characterless everywhere was that was being made because people didn't need to bother. Now it's something that everyone's talking about when you're with a team, with real city planners, and when you're working with whoever the commissioning bodies are together. Public space is a thing that is being discussed. Public access is being discussed. It's, I think, an exciting time, but it's a different model from the post-war, where governments really led construction of places. And there is something lost by that. And we're doing our best to hang in there, really, and believe that we can make things as publicly accessible as we possibly can.
You mentioned growing up then. Take us right back to the beginning. Where did you grow up? What was your family upbringing like, and how did you first become interested in making things, in design? I
was brought up in North London, and my grandmother was a German Jewish refugee who studied in Berlin at the Reimannsschule, which was the Berlin equivalent of the Bauhaus, and she was a textile designer and forced to flee in 1933, but as utter modernist, and she worked with Erno Goldfinger, who did Trellick Towers, and they formed a housing association. Erno Goldfinger got together a few of these refugees in London, and they built a housing association near Regent's Park of about 8 or 10 apartments, and my grandmother lived there for half a century. So I was brought up just staying in this. It had been a bomb site, so there were all the grand Victorian houses, and there was this little apartment block, and the quality of crystal windows and this more open layouts and efficiency. And I didn't know that that's what I was experiencing, but then I learnt to appreciate that as I was getting older. And my grandfather was a communist who had been a volunteer in the Spanish Civil War to fight the fascists, and was passionate about the lives of the working person, and had researched and written a lot of articles about the coal mining. And he was very interested in the engineers, the civil engineers and structural engineers who'd shaped Britain through the Industrial Revolution. And so that energy and excitement really about progress, but with a social dimension, was built in for me. And my father came from a musical background, but his mum was a servant at Windsor Castle, and he then studied child development, so maybe I was victim number one. My mother was a craftsperson and had started the Bead Society of Great Britain, and so in a way I'm a really totally boringly obvious outcome of some influences around, but they were influences that weren't just architecture or weren't just making or weren't just engineering, that it was very broad. And so I feel I've got a very boring, I mean, I'm smiling as you're asking me this because I'm a sort of really obvious outcome. As a little person, I was interested in engineering, so my parents would watch what I was interested in. And so if we were talking about cars, the next weekend we'd go to Olympia, for example, in London, and there would be the car show on, and they would be there looking and analysing all the cars that were there. Or if we were looking at buildings, my father then took me to Milton Keynes, where a whole new city was being built. And then there'd been an exhibition, and not just an exhibition of designs, they'd built houses of the future. So there in kind of a muddy field, we were traipsing around, and there were 15, 20 houses by the best architects at that time, ideal visions. There was a pyramid house. There were all these things that then years later, when we worked in Milton Keynes, there were these lonely prototypes having made no dent whatsoever on the broader mass housing that had been built. And now we're working with Olympia and on the future of the Olympia site. So it got sort of very different impressions, including the creation and making and the conceptual dimension and the physical impact and some of the social dimension of things. And so it's a right mishmash, but it sort of set up what I hope, and I'm trying to see, as some sort of middle, that my interest in a way, the basis of the studio was realizing that there were very disconnected worlds and disconnected mindsets where the way infrastructure was thought about was a sort of, I suppose, in any given time, there are fashions of how we think about the world around us and how we divide it up. And you know that 100 years ago, how people thought about science and building and craft and mathematics and writing and theatre was one kind of way, and 200 years before that was another way, and in 100 years from now it'll be another way. And so I feel quite wary to try to just follow the trend of a time which chops them up in one way. And certainly the design of buildings was just in its own bubble right over there. Felt very disconnected when I was studying from the people who made buildings, and that seemed to explain why the buildings I was seeing, something felt really discombobulated, or whatever the word is, really soulless feeling places, but with incredible thought. But just the outcome had felt like building design had spiraled off into its own thing, and then craft had spiraled off into another. Landscape was squished over to somewhere else. The way people thought about sculpture was in another place, and sustainability came in as a subject, but it became a technical, data-driven thing. So it seemed like there was an opportunity for a human-centric sustainability, actually, led by human experience and a application of a sort of human-centered approach to building making that could be complementary to the existing ways some of these things were thought of, and bringing in some of the values that a world of craft and the art world did that was sort of separate. That felt the opportunity. And the act of writing my thesis as an undergraduate that led to my first building project, which I visited yesterday, actually, which was, I thought, would have been in my friend's piggery by now, 1 year afterwards, but it's still standing 27 years later. So that was the first experiment with building a full-size building project, and then did my master's degree and built another building project then, trying to pull together these different approaches and angles. But it sort of started from a root of the writing part. That act of the analysis of the 4 months of researching and interviewing led to the clarity that there was this gap. There was a mismatch between the human experience of the buildings that were being built as a generality and the education process and the procurement process. As a designer, my passion is problems and gaps. And so if there's already lots of people doing one particular area, it stops being interesting. It's interesting to try and find the gaps in the format of a project. And it seemed that there was also mindsets there was an approach that was led by an aesthetic style, whereas in the world of invention, an invention was conceived to solve a particular problem or a purpose. And so it felt that mindset. It felt like there were building designers who were like, that's the one who does curvy things. That's the one who does square things. That's the one who does the all using one particular material. Or the mindset that an inventor had about problem solving didn't start with any stylistic imperative. It started with a problem and an analysis and research, and that would lead to a solution. And it felt that there was an opportunity for some of that mindset to come into projects that were in places. It was more interesting to make a place that was distinctive and particular, and maybe that was more needed now more than ever, post-digital revolution, than the personality of that design team to manifest again in a certain thing. So that's our aspiration and the gap that still exists, and trying to let all those big forces that are at play let things come out that still have personality, because those forces are powerful, that make places be repetitions of other places and make things predictable. And I think the public are smart, and it's been forgotten a lot how smart everybody is. You don't have to have studied design or architecture or art history or anything to feel in your pit of your stomach an emotional response to a place. And so it's a very interesting time, I think, to be working.
So in other words, it was a conscious decision made when you were a student to bring together all these strands like craft and architecture and landscape and the approach of the inventor. You kind of synthesized that at quite an early age then.
That was the gap that was there. And it might sound a bit funny or arrogant in some way, but when I got to the Royal College of Art, and so I'd had these 3 years to really experiment while at Manchester, and then at the Royal College of Art, you have to write another dissertation. And, quite often there was someone who was doing the history of the sewing machine, or something. Someone else is writing something very niche and very specific. And I was just very aware that's where you drop off the conveyor belt as a 24-year-old. There's no more education you can do. You've studied for 7 years and it's do it time. And so I felt that I must use those 3-4 months of reflection and writing to actually write a manifesto. I must attempt to write down what I'm going to do, why, and what's the logical basis for that. And it's funny, don't ask to have a look at it, by the way, pulling that out now and looking back at that. And that's what, to my amazement, we're actually doing. But it was that act of thinking through what's the gap. Because I think sometimes people get caught up thinking it's about expressing themselves. And I don't feel anything. Nothing's about expressing myself. The thing was, I knew when I was studying that I had this problem, which was that you were there imagining the people you admired being brilliant, and you were sitting there at the Royal College of Art, and there's a high amount of demand for each one of the places, and you could see everyone sitting there thinking, oh, I must be very good because I got into the Royal College of Art, and they're sitting in a line trying to be brilliant. And sitting there by myself, you could soldier on and maybe come up with something that was all right. But there was an engineer who used to come in, called Ron Packman, who'd come in to see us once a week. And when him and I worked together, suddenly it's like the lights came on, the flowers bloomed, and design wasn't happening in me. I wasn't being a designer. He was stopped being an engineer. And together, was I engineering? Was he designing? It didn't matter. Between us, we were growing ideas for things. The thing about buildings and pieces of city is they are incredibly complex, and it needs whole teams of people. And it became clear, I suppose, that my disability, that I didn't work by myself, didn't have my sketchbook and my big fat pen that did the genius sketches. Instead, yes, I could draw. Yes, I'm quite good at drawing. But it was about activating a conversation. I know that sounds trendy, but it was my disability. I haven't chosen to collaborate. It's not because I think collaboration is this fashionable sounding thing. I can't work efficiently, effectively by myself, and it's no fun. I feel sorry for artists who work by themselves. In the studio, in a way, has grown out of that, pulling together people and trying to convene focus and direction together about how you can make a difference to what might otherwise happen. One of the challenges was that there were books full of amazing visions of what the future could be. This is in the 1980s, and I'd go to the Architectural Association bookshop and you'd disappear into incredible books with incredible visions and thoughts. None of it was happening, and it seemed that having witnessed people who would make a car be built or make a house be built in the field in Milton Keynes or make a musical instrument happen, I was very connected to making things. And I built my first projects. I built my first building when at Manchester, which started 28 years ago, finished 27 years ago. And
is that the one you went to visit yesterday?
Yes, I went to visit yesterday. And it seemed that's it. You've got to just drive things forward rather than sit on the sidelines and with your perfect view of everything that could be perfect. Reality isn't a compromise. If reality is less good than it could have been, then that's a compromise. But how do you take the money that's available, the regulatory condition, and make something that can engage the public as best as possible, that can be as useful as possible? My journey over the last 2 decades or so has been moving and learning and getting much more interested in the city making part. I think I never thought we'd be having the scale of social impact where we could be in the middle of a conversation about that. And I found, as I was reading much more of Jane Jacobs and Christopher Alexander, it amazed me that they'd written some of the things they'd written more than 40 years ago, and everyone knew, but a lot of the ideas were not actually being made to happen. And so, in a sense, some of the things we're doing, I'm trying to put into action some of the thoughts that people around me have had and can see from a social point of view.
I was going to ask you why you studied design at Manchester rather than studying architecture, but was it maybe because you'd seen at first hand that architecture was maybe too idealistic? In the 20th century, the idea of the architect as the lone genius was kind of preeminent. Did you maybe subconsciously get that and go to do a course that was more about materials and making in collaboration?
It's very hard figuring out what to study. It's when you're interested in the gaps, because the whole point is you're interested in the gaps, because that's where often the opportunity lies. And so I had spent some time at the architecture winter school that was happening in Scotland. It would be 1990. And I'd witnessed how disconnected the architectural world at that time was from the real creation of places. There were, one by one, there was world-famous building design person who'd never built anything. And so it seemed, and I'd already built and made my own projects at a small scale. I think it's changed a lot now. And I think the architectural education is now much more engaged and talks about making a lot more. But back when it was available for me to study, it left me cold. And so I went on a course that let me create my own trajectory. And so they supported the research into building design, building a full-size building and delivering that. And we worked with the engineering department at Manchester, and there was a guy called Aaron Chadwick who'd just won Young Engineer of Britain, and he's now a partner at Atelier One. So I was just there in his kitchen working with him in the north of Manchester every evening and every weekend, and using very primitive software to work through the geometry and functionality. And so he was an incredible person to help me get going. But I realized there was this gap of engagement. People were disempowered and easily uninspired by the creation of city. And yet to me, it's the most exciting, interesting thing. We've still got a huge gap. I mean, it sounds sort of absurd when you say how interested people are in food and gardening. You know, when you look at public engagement with food and gardening, it's massive. And there are people who speak brilliantly and have strong ethical dimension that engages the public. And yet how illiterate the language of everyone is about city making. And actually, I think with Dezeen, you've gone a long way to connect with people who are nothing to do with the world of design, and they refer back through this, and so that's brilliant. But we've still got so far to go, and it's exciting and engaging. It's just fascinating how professional bodies can stop squabbling with each other and instead find ways to really excite people, because the impacts for the climate emergency and things like that are massive, but it's the language, the engagement, is interesting, how we can pull more people in and get it something that doesn't feel disconnected.
You've referred a few times to your first built project, so tell us about that. It was a small building you designed and built as part of your degree course at Manchester. But also, what was it like as someone who had this vision to contribute to the city, being surrounded by people who presumably were interested in more modest things like, I don't know, bowls or bathrooms or designing domestic objects? Were you considered like a megalomaniac or the weird guy?
There was one of my tutors had been working with Sottsass at Olivetti in Milan. In Italy, the designers, architecture and product design, all much closer, the same mindset. It's all design. There isn't a verb to architect a building, you design it. So it was,
but they all studied architecture there, didn't they, even if they then went into product design?
I was being taught by people who had that mindset. Whatever course I was on or whatever their training, I found that everyone on my course was ploughing their own furrow in their thing that they were exploring. So there were people doing very large-scale ceramics. There were people doing ceramics that could be used with buildings. And there were people doing furniture. There were people using forging and welding and quite advanced metalworking techniques, as well as down to jewellery. And I found it fascinating panning your eye across at how form might manifest in a building, but how form might manifest in jewellery, and where you appreciated the unexpected raw qualities that a material could give, and that finding that that was not happening at the largest scale. I think everyone felt eccentric and doing their things, and we all had our grants, which were just about enough to live and not need lots of other jobs. So you could really spend 3 years immersing yourself, and the tutors were very unnarrow-minded, actually, on that course. My dissertation had got a distinction, and the outcome was sort of, I remember just sitting with my dad, and he just thought, well, yeah, I suppose the obvious thing is, got 1 year left, you should make a building. It just seemed sort of a natural follow-on from the gap that dissertation illuminated. And my tutors did say to make a model, and then thought, well, you don't really learn much from models. And the courses I'd visited, and it seemed that buildings tended to always stay as white models, these sterile little white foam board models. So I just thought, well, if things are going to go wrong, the best time for them to go wrong is while you're a student. And there was one tutor who just moved to a new department called sponsorship and was twiddling his thumbs. So I went to see him. And one thing that I've found is that if a proposition is cliched and predictable, people don't get that excited. But when a proposition is unexpected or interesting, you're more likely to get people engaged. And so when the tutors started saying, well, you want to make a building? Well, like a real building, and you don't want to make a model, and you're not going to make a model, and they go, yeah, why not? And it seemed that the best thing you can do for a college is keep stretching what a college does. And it was very funny, really, because you suddenly realize that people are bored in life around you. People get bored. The caretakers all became part of it, and they'd sort of say, I've got to kick you out now at 8 o'clock, and then they'd be winking at you, knowing that you were going to climb back over the wall to carry on making the project. And then you realise that there's an empty room next to the courtyard that the textiles department have got that no one's using, and you go and speak to them and say, would you be interested to help to make a building? So I ended up with my own workshop. There was a metalwork technician. You could see he was bored. And so he worked with me for 6 months, machining the joints of the building. There was a student in the year below me who was far more popular than I was. And he got excited and thought, well, you'll learn a lot making a building. And he doesn't know what he's talking about either. So between us, I was working with Aaron, the brilliant engineer. The textile department supported with a workspace. And you're there while everyone's in the canteen looking out. Manchester's known for rain, and so you're there getting soaked. So there's a humour to an endeavour that has an unknown outcome, and 14 sponsors got involved and £25,000 worth of materials. And I think people found it sort of humorous, and in a way that's flowed through into projects as the studio got going. In a way, our first major public project was probably the Harvey Nichols project, which was in 1997, getting the planning permission to do this, and a wind corridor, getting the building control, in effect a wind tunnel between the Mandarin Oriental Hotel and the Harvey Nichols building on this public project that wove this one element through this main building in the middle of London. I remember a lot milder things had been turned down, and you realise that our lives are quite short. And if you're a maker, if you're someone who gives permission, if you're a client, people all want to make a difference. They do. And it sounds banal to use the word make a difference. But if something is confident enough, someone will think, yeah, I'd like to have made this because I'd like my grandchild to be proud that I welded that staircase or gave permission for the interesting thing. So it's a sort of multifaceted endeavour, each project that you work on, but just trying to pull people together. I mean, it starts as to whether you are able to convince yourselves, all the architects that you speak to and designers and sculptors, and particularly in the world of the built environment, we aren't in control at all. All we can do is advocate. And advocacy needs logic. And nobody, however much someone might like you or dislike you, no one will spend money. And in the public realm, it's expensive in the world of architecture and buildings, unless something makes sense. And so it's very interesting trying to look at what that means from every angle possible. And we've learnt so much. I mean, I've had projects go wrong, I've had projects go right. And so it feels now we're at quite an interesting point where we've learnt so much. And now suddenly, we're working on an airport project. We're collaborating 50-50 with an architecture practice called KPF. We're working in Tokyo on a new piece of city. We're working on a new piece of city in Prague in the Czech Republic. And we'll be finishing the Google headquarters projects in the next year or so. And we're just about to finish our cancer care centre in Leeds. And we are going to be soon finishing the residential project in Singapore. And so there's lessons that you learn and grow with. And it just takes a long time to really have a momentum and have what I feel very blessed now to have is an incredible team of partners and collaborators.
So it sounds very much like this first project you did at Manchester was where you first synthesized all of the different aspects of creativity, like landscape and structure and craft and so on and so forth, but also this methodology of teamwork, but also this gift you have of persuading people to go on the journey with you, which I think explains a lot of the projects that you've been able to land. But you haven't told us what that first project was. Describe what the building was, and also, since you went to visit it yesterday, how's it faring? What's it being used as?
I mean, the Pavilion project, it's about 6 metres by 4 metres, and it's 4 metres high, and it's a room. And because I was my own client, I could make the walls on 2 of the faces rotate like sort of gills to open so that they become columns you can walk through. But those doors that rotate, they're leaning towards you and leaning sideways. So their method of opening is quite interesting. But the building was just based on a farm building that I'd seen in the north of England, where I sort of looked at this tiled roof and something was wrong. And you looked, and this normal kind of gable top angled roof, I suddenly realised it had shifted. There'd been some shift, and so the roof had twisted a bit. So in a sense, this is a sort of archetype of an angled tiled roof that you might see, but twisted down so that the roof twists so far to become the walls of the building, and it's rotationally symmetrical. But no one had made twisted glazing. There was no twisted glazing bar system you could buy. So there was inventing the hinges, there was inventing how you could make waterproof twisted pavilion. So it's polycarbonate and aluminium, the main structure. In the end, to hold it together, the best way to hold it together was a mix of screw fixings and 2 kilometers of Velcro. So it was really, and the rubber Dunlop factory was just around the corner, and we designed a rubber gasket that would waterproof it, and they extruded all of that for a student. So it was also, there was an engagement with the manufacturers all around in the heart of a manufacturing part of the UK. But I don't feel that what we do is persuade people. That's not the thing. You are explaining. That's all we're doing, is that you're explaining and analysing. We're not in control. All we're doing is trying to put forward a logic and an argument. So there's no magic waving of wands, and there's no subliminal kind of telepathy going on when we're talking. A lot of time is spent in the studio sitting and analysing, and often then you realise you're wrong and you've got to start. Therefore, the design thinking has to be adjusted and rethought to try to find what is true logical thing that you can explain. And I think it's a way to put something down by going, well, you persuade people with your voodoo eyes or something like that, which is not. All you're doing is you trying to find the truth in a project and trying to find a way to explain something and keep developing your design until it's explainable. If something isn't a clear thought, you won't convince anyone. Convincing and designing aren't separate things. They're the same thing.
And where is your first building now, and how is it looking?
So it's a bit covered in leaves, bit needing some love and restoration, but it was intended to only last for 1 year maximum, well, just to get through the degree shows. And the engineering that Aaron did and the making we did has lasted much longer than I thought, but it needs some love and care. And it's, I think the next bit of love, and maybe it can last another 25 years, to my amazement.
Thomas, thank you very much.
Was that an hour? Oh my God.
Thanks for listening. This podcast was sponsored by Twinmotion and produced by our in-house creative team, Dezeen Studio, with music by Yuri Suzuki from Pentagram. To find out more, go to dezeen.com/podcast. You can keep up to date on past and future episodes of Face to Face by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.